Imagine London, not London today. No mobile phones, no television, no radio, no Twitter, no YouTube, no 24-hour news. Go back, let's say about 300 years. Walk with me. Let's go down Fleet Street. What do you hear? You hear horses, printers, men shouting, sheets of paper being carried through narrow streets, coffee houses filled with arguments about politics, the crown, parliament, war, and scandal. And in 1702, London gets what historians describe as the first daily newspapers, the Daily Courant. Interestingly, its first editor promised readers something that sounds almost quaint today. The newspaper would report the facts and allow readers to make up their own minds. 300 years later, perhaps that is where we should begin, because Britain would eventually develop one of the most aggressive, competitive, and politically consequential newspaper culture in the democratic world. And it didn't happen overnight. It was built piece by piece, owner by owner, technology by technology, scandal by scandal, until newspapers became more than chronicles of British society. They became participants in British society, sometimes campaigners, sometimes kingmakers, sometimes moral guardians, sometimes entertainers, sometimes investigators doing extraordinary public interest journalism, and sometimes something considerably darker. So today, I want us to take a journey. Are you ready? Not simply through tabloid journalism, through British power. Because if you want to understand the British tabloids, you first have to understand how Britain learned to live with newspapers. Welcome. This is Majesty's Sussex Report, and I'm Antonio. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time here with us. Don't go anywhere. Here is the intro. Thank you for sticking around. I really do appreciate it. So, are you ready to go on this journey with me? Well, come along. Here is something fascinating. For much of Britain's early newspaper history, newspapers were relatively expensive. Government taxes on newspapers and paper restricted their ability, right? And their availability to most people. There was even a phrase for these charges: the taxes on knowledge. Okay? So, taxes on knowledge. The newspaper stamp had existed since the reign of Queen Anne. Parliament's own historical record notes that the tax emerged as newspapers increasingly became commentators and political partisan rather than simply chronicles of event. Think about what that means, okay? Even 300 years ago, governments understood something fundamental. Information creates political power. If ordinary people can read political arguments, criticize government, and share ideas, authority becomes harder to control. Do you need me to repeat that? So, if ordinary people can read political arguments, criticize government, and share ideas, authority becomes harder to control. Let me tell you. That is still evidence. That is still facts to this day. That is why I often say, and I've said this for a long time, knowledge. Knowledge is important. Know your history, know your story, be mindful of who is telling it, be mindful to correct it, and don't be ashamed of it, right? So then comes one of the great turning points. The newspaper stamp duty disappeared in 1855. The paper duty follows in 1861. At almost the same time, Britain is changing rapidly. Railways spread newspapers around the country. Printing technology improves. The telegraph moves information faster. Education and literacy expand. And suddenly, the newspaper is no longer simply a luxury for gentlemen sitting inside private clubs. You can sell news to the masses. And once millions of ordinary people become potential customers, journalism changes. Because now there is money in attention. So now think about this, all right? If your livelihood depends upon thousands, eventually millions of people choosing your newspaper rather than the one beside your newspaper, right beside it, what do you do? Do you make the headline calmer, more civil, or do you make it louder? Do you tell readers this is a complicated matter requiring careful consideration? Or do you tell them scandal, outrage, betrayal? Now, that commercial tension is going to shape everything that comes next. Now, let's get into our own time machine. We're not going to borrow Doctor Who's. Let's get into our own. And let's leap forward to 1896. Hmm. And we meet a man who changes British journalism, Alfred Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe. With his brother Harold, later Lord Rothermere. Does that name sound familiar? He launches the Daily Mail. Does that name sound familiar? The idea is brilliant. Make the newspaper inexpensive, make the stories shorter, make the language accessible, include human interest, competitions, features, stories especially appealing to women, entertainment, politics, emotion. The Mail becomes an extraordinary commercial success and reaches a circulation of more than 1 million in the early 20th century. Historians identify it as one of the decisive developments in Britain's mass circulation popular press. And something important has happened. Harmsworth isn't merely selling news, he is learning how to package the world. What matters? What doesn't matter? Who should frighten you? Who represents respectable Britain? Who threatens Britain? Who is heroic? Who is ridiculous? Now, who belongs and who doesn't? That power is far greater than simply printing information. It is cultural power. And remember the family name, Hamsworth, because Alfred's brother, Harold, becomes the first Viscount Rothermere. And more than a century later, a company that grows from those newspapers, interest remains controlled by the Rothermere family. DMGT says today it is 100% owned by Rothermere Continuation Limited. So, when we talk about British newspaper dynasties, we are not speaking metaphorically. There is extraordinary continuity. Kingdoms have fallen, Britain lost an empire, governments came and went, radio arrived, television arrived, the internet arrived, social media arrived. And the Rothermere? Well, the Rothermere newspaper dynasty endured. That tells you something about the durability of media power. And Northcliffe discovers something else. If millions of people read your newspapers every day, politicians have to pay attention to you. Academic histories of the British press described Northcliffe and later proprietors such as Lord Rothermere and Lord Beaverbrook not simply as businessmen, but as press barons who used their newspapers to pursue political campaigns and attack government. Now think about that change. Previously, the newspaper tells you what the government did. Now, the newspaper owners can attempt to influence what the government will do next. That is a completely different kind of institution. Northcliffe's newspaper empire became deeply involved in public argument surrounding the First World War. Scholarship on that period documents the extraordinary political influence of his newspapers and his involvement in wartime propaganda. And he was not alone. Lord Beaverbrook would build enormous influence through the Daily Express, Rothermere through newspapers including the Mail. Suddenly, Britain had something it had never possessed on this scale before. Private individuals with the ability to communicate simultaneously with millions of citizens. Now you may be asking yourself, well, what is this? What's a press baron? Well, let me tell you. He's not elected. You cannot vote him out. He does not have to stand in parliament, but every morning he can place an argument before millions of voters. That is power, and politicians understood it. Now, this is where the story becomes cultural rather than simply political. Popular newspapers were not publishing parliamentary reports all day. They were telling Britain stories about Britain, about empire, about war, about crime, morality, women, sexuality, foreigners, about class, about royalty, about who was respectable, about who was suspicious, about who represented the country, and who supposedly threatened it. Historians of the British popular press describe newspapers as important actors in the 20th century political, social, and cultural life, not merely observers of it. That is crucial to understand because culture is partly constructed through repetition. If you keep telling people that they're this, they're this, they're this, they're this, they start to believe that they're this. If you start to tell people that is the danger, that's the danger, that's the danger, that's the danger, they start to believe that that's the danger. If a group of people is repeatedly presented as dangerous, people begin associating that group with danger. If someone is repeatedly described as greedy, greed attacks itself to their name. If somebody is repeatedly called difficult, eventually you don't even need evidence anymore to think that they're difficult. The name itself carries the allegation. And this is something we will return to when we reach the 21st century. We may have to get into a time travel machine again. Now, since we do our best here to bring you the most fair analysis and reporting, I want to correct a bit of a misconception, not misinformation, rather misconception. British newspapers do not all have the same politics. Historically, the Mirror had been associated with Labour and the political left. The Mail and Telegraph have generally aligned with Conservatives. Now, The Sun, The Express have moved their endorsements at different moments and different times. In fact, The Sun endorsed Labour in the 2024 election after years of Conservative support. So, this isn't really that simple for us to just label one thing one and the other. Because there's been times where it has changed. The conservative press is bad, you know? That would be historically lazy, really. The deeper issue is the culture of the national press: competition, sensationalism, personalization, political campaigning, and the economics of attention. You can be left wing and sensational. You can be right wing and sensational. You can call yourself a quality newspaper and still participate in a media pylon. The last point matters, okay? Because tabloid, what's the word I'm looking for? Tabloidization, I guess? It is not merely the physical size of a newspaper, it can become a style, emotion before proportion, personality before policy, conflict before complexity. And then in 1969, another figure enters our story: Rupert Murdoch. Yes, that one. He acquires The Sun. News UK owns history records that the first Murdoch owned tabloid edition appeared on November 17, 1969. Murdoch later acquired The Times and Sunday Times in 1981. And The Sun becomes enormously successful. By the end of the 1970s, it had overtaken the Daily Mirror as Britain's most widely read tabloid. Now the competition becomes savage. It becomes all about sex, celebrity, football, politics, royalty, scandal, big pictures, big headlines, short words, strong emotions. You don't simply read the news. The newspapers talk to you. It knows who we are, and it tells you who they are. And here we begin seeing the full force of something that will become central to modern tabloid culture. Are you ready for it? The creation of the villain. Yes, sir. Yes, the villain. Because every ongoing story needs what? A villain. But also it needs hero, victim, traitor, snob, hypocrite, fraud. A soap opera, I tell you. And once someone has been assigned one of those roles, new stories are interpreted through the character already created for them. Think about that. I mean, really sit with it and think about that. Does it sound familiar? It better, because it is.
Over Sydney Harbour Bridge by Rolls-Royce, Rupert Murdoch on his way to his office. If the News of the World deal goes through, he'll transfer his base to London. Murdoch inherited the basis of his newspaper empire from his father, built on it and enlarged it to cover every state in Australia. He's chubby-cheeked and open-faced, but underneath, say those who know him, he's a man of steel. Ruthless in getting his own way, iron-willed in seeing that his plans are carried through. If he succeeds in gathering the news of the world reigns into his hands, it's likely they'll be in for some pretty aggressive management. Murdoch's Australian empire also extends to the booming pop record business. And he has several television stations scattered around Australia as well. He's been likened to a junior Lord Thomson, and his management and consistent empire building certainly have the Thomson hallmark. But there's a difference. He takes an active part in what goes into his papers, even going into the composing room to supervise what's in the page proofs for next day's edition.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor and being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. Although, if I can just hold you there for a minute, I think that this question of the power of newspaper proprietors can be greatly overdone. We have more responsibility than power, I think. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil.
For much of the 20th century, Fleet Street wasn't merely a London road. It became shorthand for the British national press. Editors knew politicians, journalists knew police officers, reporters knew palace staff, proprietors knew prime ministers, and proximity creates information. But proximity can also create influence. Decades later, when Lord Justice Leveson investigated the culture, practices, and ethics of the press after the phone hacking scandal, his inquiry specifically examined relationships between the press, politicians, and police. That's extraordinary. Really, it really is. Think about what was being examined. Not simply did a journalist make a mistake, but what relationships had developed between some of the most powerful institutions in British society: government, police, media. That is a much bigger question. And somewhere inside this ecosystem sits another British institution, the monarchy. For newspapers, royalty is almost the perfect product. Politics without an election, celebrity with constitutional significance, family drama with palaces, marriage, divorce, birth, death, money, fashion, sex, jealousy, status, succession. There is always another story. And for the monarchy, newspapers have historically provided something valuable too: visibility. Royal tours matter because people see them. Charitable work matters because somebody reports it. Ceremony requires an audience. So the palace and the press developed a relationship based upon something both sides possesses and both sides want: access. Today, there is a Royal Rota through which accredited journalists and photographers receive pooled access to many royal engagements. The royal household itself well, refers publicly to media positions reserved for members of the Royal Rota. The system has a practical purpose. You cannot put hundreds of journalists into every room, but around formal systems of access grows something less formal: sources, contacts, briefing, courtiers, friends of, palace insiders, a royal source, people close to, and suddenly the anonymous source becomes a recurring character in British royal journalism. Now, here is my question. You ready? When you read palace sources say, Who exactly is the palace? Which household? Which employee? What what interest do they have? Who benefits from that story? And why was it given to that journalist? Those are questions media consumers should ask far more often. Really, ask it. And then came Diana. And if there was one moment when millions of people suddenly looked at Britain's relationship with celebrity journalism and asked whether something had gone terribly wrong, it was 1997. Diana had been one of the most photographed women on earth. Her relationships became stories, her holidays became stories, her clothing became stories, her body became stories. Her private life became an international commercial product. After her death in Paris, public anger focused intensely upon the paparazzi and the media culture surrounding her. Her brother famously described her as one of the most hunted people of the modern age, and press rules on harassment and privacy were subsequently strengthened. Britain seemed to ask itself, have we gone too far? And for a moment, there was remorse. But remorse is not the same thing as structural change. Then came another reckoning: phone hacking. The scandal exposed unlawful access to voicemail by people working for newspapers, celebrities, politicians, royal figures, and most appallingly, victims of crime. That scandal led to the closure of Murdoch's News of the World and ultimately to the Levinson inquiry into press culture and ethics. And suddenly, the argument wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't some newspapers can be unpleasant. This was how far had parts of the industry been prepared to go to obtain a story, and how had the system permitted it. There is a lovely irony here. The newspapers eventually left Fleet Street. Murdoch moved his operations to Wapping in the 1980s. Other publishers followed elsewhere. By 2016, the last newspaper journalist working on Fleet Street had departed. But the phrase survived: Fleet Street, meaning the British press, because Fleet Street was no longer merely an address, it had become a culture. And then the internet arrived. And instead of killing tabloid journalism, in some ways, it removed the final restraint. The newspapers once had one front page per day. The website has hundreds. The printing press stopped overnight. The internet never stops. Now you need another story about Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. You need one at 10:15, another at noon, another at 3, another because somebody said something on television about her, another because someone responded, another because an unnamed source responded to the response. And the story can reproduce itself indefinitely. Ofcan found that by 2025, online news consumption had reached 70% of UK adults, overtaking individual traditional platforms such as print. So, tablet culture did not disappear, it became digital. And now we arrive at, well, 2026. we didn't need a time machine for that one, right? Because we are in 2026 presently. The ownership names have changed. The concentration remains striking. The Media Reform Coalition 2025 analysis found that DMG Media, News UK, and Reach together controlled around 90% of UK national newspaper circulation. Let me translate that for you. DMG Media includes the Daily Mail, that entire family of titles, and is part of the Rothermere controlled DMGT. News UK owns The Sun, The Times, and The Sunday Times, and they're wholly owned by News Corp. Reach owns more than 120 brands, including The Mirror, Express, Daily Star, Daily Record, and major regional publications. And one important update for today: the Telegraph is now owned by by Germany's Axel Springer. I think that's the way it's pronounced. If not, my apologies. Which completed its acquisition of the Telegraph Media Group on June 30th, 2026. And if I'm not mistaken, I actually think that the Rothermeres were trying to acquire the Telegraph also. So, I would not say that three billionaires control all British media. It isn't accurate to actually say that. And we don't need it. The truth is powerful enough. A very small number of corporations command an enormous share of Britain's national newspaper market. I don't need to say it. 90%. So here's the question: does that mean they control what Britain thinks? Right? All that ownership? I would say yes, and at the same time, I would say no. And let me justify what I'm saying. Because this is important, right? People are not robots. At least we think they're not. A newspaper cannot insert an opinion directly into somebody's brain. Political science research is much more nuanced about whether newspapers determine voting behavior. But media can do something enormously important. It can decide what deserves attention. It can repeat, it can frame, it can amplify. It can make something appear abnormal. It can turn an isolated incident into a national conversation. And research has found evidence that sustained tabloid campaigns can affect public attitudes over time. One major study examining the Sun Eurocentric campaign found long term effects on public opinion. That is where the power lies. Not believe this. It's more often sort of like look here, look over here, and look again and again and again. That's how it works, by repetition. And now let's talk about Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. This is why I wanted us to take the historical journey first. Because Meghan did not encounter several unpleasant journalists. She encountered a centuries old media culture, a competitive national newspaper system, a royal access system, a celebrity economy, a political press, a digital outrage economy, and established organizations whose commercial survival increasingly depends upon attention. Academic research examining British tabloid language around Harry and Meghan specifically notes the role of emotive language, wordplay, and sensational framing in, in converting serious matters into entertainment for mass audiences. And consider what repetition does. One negative article is an article. 10 becomes a narrative. 100 became a reputation. Thousands become something approaching an alternative biography. Eventually, the public no longer asks, "Hey, what happened?" They say, "Oh, that's just what she's like." Huh, nothing new. But how do they know? Did they meet her? Did they work with her? Did they live with her? Or have they encountered the same character repeatedly through headlines? Remember that. They've met her, but they've met her through the headlines. They've met her through the newspapers. They've met her through the digital campaign. They've met an artificial person and they think they know the real person, right? I mean, it's a valid question to ask because they've met the character through a headline. And now, Professor Jason Arday, may he rest in peace. It brings us back to him. Not because his story is identical to Meghan's, it isn't. Not because academics should escape scrutiny, they shouldn't. Not because every allegation made against him should automatically be rejected, it shouldn't. But because after 300 years of British newspaper history, we should be sophisticated enough to distinguish between investigation and spectacle, between reporting and allegation, and creating a national event around a human being, between accountability and appetite. And perhaps this is the question British journalists must have to confront again. When have you published enough? When does the public interest end? When does repetition cease providing new information? And when does the subject stop being a story and becomes prey? And there is one part of this story we cannot avoid. I would say the politics of fear, grievance, who to blame. Because newspapers do not create every fear from nothing. Sometimes the fear is already there. Britain has changed. The factories that supported entire communities have disappeared, no longer there. Housing is expensive. Public service are strained. Wages have staggered for many, many people. The country is more ethnically diverse. Women occupy positions once reserved almost entirely for men. Queer people, gay men, women marry. Transgender people are more visible. The old social hierarchy is less certain. The church has less authority. The empire is gone. The monarchy itself has changed. And for some people, particularly those who feel that the country they understood is disappearing around them, this can produce something very human: disorientation. Where do I belong? What happened to the country I remember? Why, why can't my children afford a house? Why can't I see a doctor? Why does everything seem so different? Those are legitimate questions. Of course they are. But then comes the dangerous question: who did this to you? And grievance politics offers an answer. Not the housing system, not decades of economic policy, not underinvestment, not inequality, not corporate decisions, not governments, someone much easier to see: the migrant. the Muslim, the refugee, the black family, the gay couple, the transgender person, someone beneath you in the hierarchy of power suddenly becomes responsible for everything you believe you have lost. And this is where parts of the right, I mean, political right, and much more aggressively the far right, have discovered an extraordinarily effective political language. It is a language of let's take it back. Hmm? Let's take back our borders, take back our streets, take back our country, protect our women, protect our children, restore our culture, make Britain, oh, Britain, make Britain what Britain used to be again. Notice what all of those phrases imply. Something has been taken from you. And if something has been taken, someone must have taken it. The newspaper headlines then supply the face. You've seen the formula. Migrants in hotels. Sometimes it says luxury hotels. I mean, Farage is just very, very good at this. And here is where framing matters. There is a legitimate public policy story here. Housing asylum seekers in hotels is enormously expensive. In 2026, the Home Office estimated hotel accommodations at around £144 per person per night, compared with roughly 23,000 £23.25 per dispersal accommodation. Oxford Migration Observatory likewise describes hotel use as far more expensive than ordinary asylum accommodation. That deserves investigation. Who receives the contracts, right? That's important. Why did government allow the asylum backlog to become so large? Why is the taxpayer paying those prices? Could accommodation have been organized more effectively? Those are journalism questions. But watch what happens when the story changes from government is paying enormous sums to contractors for an inefficient asylum system. Let me read that again. Government is paying enormous sums to contractors for an ineffective asylum system. Two, migrants are living in luxury hotels while you struggle. You see the difference? Which one is going to make you angry? Which one is going to allow you to point the finger? Those are not psychologically the same story. In the second version, the person receiving basic accommodation becomes the beneficiary of your suffering. You have someone to point to. How dare they? Yet asylum seekers housed in hotels are not receiving the nightly hotel rate as spending money. That money largely represents the government's accommodation cost, while official subsistence support can be as little as £9. £9 per person per week. It can go up to £49 per week, depending on circumstances. And suddenly we see the trick. The cost of government failure becomes evident of migrant privilege, right? And anger travels downward. The same mechanism can operate with race, with sexuality, with transgender people, with religious minorities. Social change becomes personalized. Instead of debating complex questions about gender, education, healthcare, or law, an entire minority can become the subject of constant cultural alarm. And again, I want to be precise here. There are legitimate debates to be had about migration, immigration, and all of that. There are legitimate debates about asylum policy. There are legitimate debates about sex, gender, medicine, sports, and safeguarding. Democracy requires those debates. The problem begins when disagreement becomes dehumanization, when an entire group becomes a threat, when every story involving that group confirms the threat, when exceptions become representative, and when people cease being citizens or human beings and become categories of illegals, invaders, the woke mob, the trans agenda, the Muslims, the foreigners. At that point, journalism is no longer merely describing a debate. It can become part of a process of constructing an enemy. And Britain has always seemed ready, ready. And Britain has already seen what can happen when that combustible mixture meets misinformation. After three children were murdered in Southport in July 2024, false claims spread online that the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker or migrant. He was not. But the correction came too late for the story that had already entered people's bloodstream. Anti migration disorder spread across Britain. Mosques were attacked, hotels housing asylum seekers were attacked, people of color were assaulted and intimidated. Parliament subsequent inquiry noted that false claims surrounding Southport helped drive the unrest and that algorithmic recommendations accelerated divisive narratives. And the Home Office later recorded a 19% rise in hate crimes targeting Muslims, including a pronounced spike following the Southport murder and disorder. That is the moment when words leave the page, when grievance leaves the screen, when somebody who has been told repeatedly that an enemy is destroying his country, her country, encounters an actual human being belonging to the group he or she has been taught to fear. That is where rhetoric can become consequence. And perhaps this is the oldest political trick in history. When people have less, tell them to look at somebody who has even less than them. When they cannot afford a house, show them a refugee in a hotel. When they feel culturally disoriented, show them a transgender person. When their community has declined, show them a immigrant neighborhood. When they feel powerless, give them somebody more powerless to conquer. Because it is much easier to persuade a struggling man that the stranger besides him stole his future than to persuade him to examine the institutions above them both. Now, I want to ask you something. When you are being encouraged to be furious with somebody, look at who has the power. Does the asylum seeker control housing policy? Does the transgender teenager control the NHS? Does the immigrant family set your wages? Does the black professor own the newspaper? Or are we sometimes being encouraged to look downwards so that we never look upward? That question matters, my friends. It matters. That is why this history we have traveled through today is not ancient history. Northcliffe discovered more than a century ago that emotion sells newspapers. Modern political movements have learned that grievance mobilizes voters. Social media discovered that anger drives engagement. Put those three things together, fear, grievance, and amplification, and you have something extraordinarily powerful. Sometimes the result is an election campaign, sometimes a newspaper crusade, sometimes years of hostility towards one public figure, and sometimes, as Britain witnessed in the summer of 2024, a frightening crowd standing outside a building containing people they have never met, convinced that those people are responsible for a country they believe they have lost. That is when the story stops being merely about newspapers. It becomes a story about society itself and about the terrible things that can happen when a nation searching for answers is repeatedly handed enemies instead of answers. Maybe the British tabloid press did not begin with cruelty. It began with possibility. Cheap newspapers brought information to millions. They increased access to politics. They exposed corruption. They challenged governments. They entertained. They campaigned. They gave ordinary people information once reserved for elites. That history deserves acknowledgement. A free press remains indispensable to democracy. But somewhere along the journey, another form of power grew beside that freedom: the power to define people, the power to repeat an accusation until it becomes identity, the power to elevate, the power to humiliate, the power to decide who receives context and who receives contempt. 300 years ago, Britain's first daily newspapers reportedly promised to give readers the facts and allow them to make their own reflections. Perhaps that old promise is worth remembering because journalism should investigate power, it should challenge institutions, it should expose wrongdoing, it should make powerful people uncomfortable. But journalism should never become so powerful itself that it forgets to ask, who is scrutinizing us? And when an industry can pursue politicians, celebrities, professors, princes and duchesses, or a duke, or almost anyone placed before the national firing squad, perhaps the question is no longer simply, what did this person do? Perhaps we also need to ask, what did the machine do with them and why? That is the history of the British tabloid press. But more importantly, it may also be the history of how Britain learned who to look at, who to listen to, who to fear, and sometimes who to hate. Oh well, oh well, oh well, it's close to an hour. And I have to thank you for your patience hanging on here. And for those of you who've made it through, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really do hope that you learned something because in doing this research, because I was curious myself, I hope I've done you some justice in bringing this information to you. because I think it's so very important what information does, what knowledge does. The more you know, the better person you can be. Now there are those who it doesn't matter how much information you put in front of them or how much knowledge you try to explain to them, they will never ever change their minds because they've been brainwashed and they've been conditioned to think the way that they do. But if we can at least get one person to rethink the way they think, then I think that one person could influence perhaps two more people, and those two more can influence 10, and 10 can influence 20, and 20 can influence 100. And we can change the narrative and change the way how these newspapers and the power that they have, because it's not just newspapers now, right? These newspaper owners own um, very influential online platforms. And those online platforms have extraordinary influence on everything that controls our existence today. If you don't think that they have power over us, think again. They have power over every single thing we do. So I really do hope that you got something out of today's podcast. I want to say thank you, as always, to the subscribers. Thank you for subscribing. I really appreciate it. To the members, thank you for your trust in what I do and how I do it. Thank you for your continued support. And to those new subscribers, gee, man, like, thank you so very much. For those of you who come here for this, for those of you who are here for the lyrics of the songs that I put together, thank you. Thank you for supporting this channel. It means the world to me. And there's nothing else to say other than if you're new and you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe. Please use those thumb or the thumb thing to say, hey, this was a good one. I liked it. Right? Leave a comment saying, hey, this was good. Don't say it was bad because I'm not gonna I'm joking. Just leave a comment, but be constructive in what you would say. If you don't see your comment being published, please know that the comments go through a sort of um, filter before they are published. And if there are things that are untrue, things we can't really prove, or I mean things that are just grotesque or blatantly rude, um, then it doesn't get published. Listen, if you're gonna insult me, call me names, say things about me, don't waste your time. Really don't. It means la la di da la 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 to me. Exactly. Absolutely nothing. Nada. Niente. Zero. Okay? So, merci. Thank you so very much. Muchas gracias a todos. And that's it, my friends. I love you all. I love you. So be kind to yourself. All right? Be kind to your loved ones and to that stranger who's crossing your path. Be kind to them because you never freaking know. Okay? You never know. Until we speak again, God bless. Big hugs and mwah. Ciao, ciao.
They said, look over there. I said, why? Rent went up, wages stayed low. Everybody's asking where the good days go. Then somebody points at the stranger next door. Says, that's who took what you had before. But he don't own the building, she don't make the rules. They got us fighting for the crumbs while somebody owns the food. Every time you're hurting, they give you someone to blame. But the one with nothing didn't build this game. Look up, don't look down. Look up, don't look down. They point at me while they run this town. Look up, don't look down. Look up, don't look down. If I got nothing, why you blaming me now? Look up, don't look down. Look up, don't look down. Different color, different prayer, different kind of love, different clothes we wear. They say, be afraid they're changing your world while the same old hands keep taking in the boat.